There are two types of players in the world. Only one chord? Great! Only one chord? Great. The ability to play on songs that have a limited number of chord changes is just as important to our improvisational language as playing on tunes that are built on a million 2-5-1s. Today we're going to delve into the Miles Davis tune So What. This tune and other ones like this are ones we often learn at the beginning of our improvisational journey. However, you'll probably find that if you just learn the Dorian mode and sort of go for it, you don't really end up sounding like Miles. Before we jump into some ways that you can successfully improvise on these tunes, let's just think about the reasons why it can be so difficult to take the next step on this type of tune. The first and biggest reason is that just because there is a limited amount of harmony and you don't need to know a lot of arpeggios or different scales to choose the right notes, you still need to be able to build coherent melodies with good phrasing. For a lot of beginning improvisers, this is challenging because you don't have those melodies in your ear yet. Even though you don't need to know a million different scales, you still have to be able to create a melody that has a clear beginning, middle, and ending, even if it's only based on a small handful of notes. The second reason why these tunes can be challenging is they often are not good vehicles for us, quote unquote, plugging in ideas or licks. Many improvisers, including myself, have spent and do spend a fair amount of time learning different short melodic chunks, whether they fit on a 2-5-1, a minor chord, whatever. Plugging those in on this sort of tune as a way to learn the language might not work very well because the harmony is so static and just sort of sits there. It's really up to you to create and be creative and not just sort of cut and paste the way you might on a fast-moving tune that is based on a bunch of 2-5-1s. The final area that both beginning and more experienced improvisers struggle on these type of tunes is there's kind of endless options because there's only one chord. This both sort of boxes us in, but also leaves almost everything open. So sometimes when we have all that openness, we tend to ramble and we don't edit ourselves because we want to go in every single option rather than choosing one option and making it really work. So there's a quick breakdown of why I think these type of tunes can be challenging for young and more experienced musicians. Let's talk about the ways that we solve this tune or kind of learn to sound good on this type of song, whether it be So What or another tune that has these long chunks of one chord. While many people start by learning the mode, we're going to actually put that a little bit further along in the process. We're going to start by learning our chord tones and our arpeggios. Now, obviously this tune actually has two chords. It has a D minor 7 chord and an E flat minor 7 chord. We are really just going to talk about the D minor section today. You can apply all these concepts over to the E flat minor section as well. To start with, you just want to know that D minor 7 chords, upwards, downwards, backwards, all inversions, all that type of stuff, and ask yourself, can I build melodies with it? So our chord is pretty straightforward. It's a root, a flat third, a fifth, and a flat 7. Now, there's lots of ways you can practice this. Some of these we've talked about on the channel, so you can check some of that stuff out. But once you've worked it so you feel really confident in all different ranges, all inversions, what we're going to do is we're just going to move that into the tune. And you're going to limit yourself and only play chord tones. But don't just do it as an exercise. Ask yourself, can I make melodies with these? Many melodies that we play are actually mostly made of chord tones. And so we should be able to construct a coherent melody with good phrasing, good articulation, good sound with just the chord tones. We might not build a whole solo like this, but as an exercise, it's very important. We've got to be able to both know academically and hear what it sounds like to be inside of the chord. So that way, when we drift out of the chord, or not even necessarily out of the chord, but maybe we're just not resolving to a chord tone, we can hear our way back and know what resolution feels like and sounds like. So let's just check out a little 8-bar example of me doing just this exercise. Now I'm just going to stick to the the minor 7th chord. So we're not even going to worry about the extensions yet. This is just the root, the flat third, the fifth, and the flat 7. Okay, once you get a handle on that, then you can add the extensions in there. So here, if we keep stacking up thirds above that 7th, we're going to get to the extended parts of this chord. Now, I've labeled these in blue and I've stacked them up actually next to the chord so you can see them. Obviously, they could occur in any range of the horn, any inversion, all that type of stuff, but we are going to think about them all stacked up vertically in this case. Now I'm going to do the same exercise where I only rely on chord tones. So obviously I'm playing all the notes in the scale now. So it might kind of seem like, well, Sean, why the heck don't you just play the mode? And that's because the way we play these notes matter. If we're just going to say, I'm just going to play whatever notes, why don't we just learn the chromatic scale and go for it? That's not going to get you where you want to go. You want to really think about how these connect to the chords. Some of the notes are going to sound more consonant, more resolved. Some of them are going to sound more dissonant or less resolved. It's not that the dissonance is bad, but it wants to resolve back to those primary chord tones. So let's check it out with all the extensions now at our disposal. Cool. Thing number 2. Once you've got your chord tones together and you feel very confident about knowing what those sound like and knowing academically where they sit on your horn, next step for me is learning pentatonics on this and working the pentatonic scale. Pentatonics are my go-to way to sort of focus and simplify melody building. That's really what we're doing when we're improvising. We are just composing melodies on the spot, and the pentatonic scale is a great way to focus our options. If, again, we have everything to choose from, we can sound a little rambly or not focused. This is going to help us to build strong melodies. Now, we're not going to delve super deep into the pentatonic scale today. If you don't know what this is, we're talking about minor pentatonics here. It's the root, the flat third, the fourth, the fifth, the flat 7, and then the root again. This is an incredibly potent scale to build melodies. So let's check it out through just 8 bars of So What. I'm only going to play the pentatonic scale when I'm building my solo here. So let's check out what that would sound like. Cool. To my ear, that really starts to sound and feel like jazz. So much of the language is pentatonic when we really get down to it. Now, I will say one other thing that's really great to practice on this sort of tune where we have these long chunks of the same chord color is to maybe work on some of the patterns that really work well in the pentatonic scale. Again, not to delve too far into this today, but we could play things that have 3-note groupings. 4-note groupings. Maybe things that skip every other note, or what we might call diatonic thirds, diatonic to the pentatonic scale. All of these and a million other ones are at your disposal, and if this is information you're working on, particularly if you're practicing at pentatonic scale, you really should be trying to get some of this stuff under your fingers. This type of tune is a wonderful place to practice it because you have a lot of time to work it out either in a technical way or even in a musical way, which would really be, I think, the end goal. So maybe you take one of these patterns and you manipulate it in a musical way so it doesn't just sound like an exercise. Let's see what that would sound like on this tune. Okay, now that we've got our arpeggios together, we know a little bit about the pentatonic scale. The next step would be finally to introduce our mode. Now, this tune would be referred to as a modal tune, so it can seem like, we're sort of burying the lead here. But I think we really need to have good command of those other things before we jump to the mode. For whatever reason, once we learn this scale, and really it starts to kind of get us in this sort of scale mindset, I tend to find my students play solos that sound like this. Now, all those notes were right. They were all in the mode. They're not going to sound dissonant against the chord, but for whatever reason, as soon as we start thinking about this mode, I find people stop thinking about phrasing, they stop thinking about articulation, they stop thinking about swing. They just want to satisfy that I can hit the little checkbox of I know this mode. The mode is just a tool. It's just there so we can access a particular sound. It shouldn't be the main thing that drives our melodies. It's just going to give us some other options. We've got to have those melodies in our head. So rather than just thinking that the mode is something I sort of noodle around in and then I'm like winning improvisation, instead we're going to think of a couple things that the mode does do for us and ways we can use it successfully to just enhance the way we can build ideas. The first thing that this Dorian mode can help us with is connecting chord tones and making our chord-based ideas feel a little more horizontal. As an example, say we had this arpeggio idea. Now, nothing wrong with it, pretty straightforward, not necessarily super compelling. It's just the root, the flat third, the fifth. I played it with a nice rhythm, played it hopefully with some good sound. It's going to be effective. But if I want to sort of like flesh that out a little bit, develop it possibly, or just make it feel like it doesn't have any jumps, that it's more of a scale type of shape, I'm going to use my notes from the mode. So in the example that'll be on the screen, you'll see I left my chord tones highlighted in red, and then the other notes are just the notes from the Dorian mode. So that sounds like a very idiomatic idea. And again, I was just thinking about connecting the chord tones with the notes that are drawn from this Dorian mode. The second thing that this way of thinking about scales can really help us with is to be able to access the extensions in a horizontal way. Now, when we practiced them earlier, we were thinking vertically about how they stacked up. Here, we could think about them sideways. And how can we get to some of those extension sounds without having to think so vertically across the chord? Say we're really hearing that 13 sound on this minor chord. In this case, we're going to be hitting a B natural. It's a very specific sound, actually one of the more colorful notes in the chord. And so maybe we think, all right, this mode is going to give me access to that sound, or using the mode as the way to build the idea is going to give me access to that sound. Because we know that I can hit any of those notes in that mode, I can find some of those other sounds without having to like extend all the way up through the horn. Now, obviously you don't have to do that when you think about extensions when they're stacked up in a chord. They can happen in any range, but the mode can get you moving in the right direction. The final thing the mode does for us is it just helps us create different ideas that pentatonic scales and arpeggios are not necessarily going to help us create. I would argue that actually most of these are really kind of like the first concept where I'm connecting chord tones with notes from the mode, but they do have different melodic shapes that are possible because of this mode versus the pentatonic scale or the arpeggios. Let's just hear a couple of examples. So each one of those ideas was a little bit different and even introduced just one non-harmonic tone, which we'll get to in a second, but they really draw from the mode as the way we're kind of building these ideas. Now, a couple of those examples I just played, as I mentioned, had some non-harmonic tones, and that brings us to our last point. Introducing some dissonant notes into your lines is going to help them be more interesting and give them a little bit more dimension and push them forward on these long chunks of the same chord color. When we're playing on minor chords, the most important one that we try to get a handle on and understand how it sounds and understand how we can use it is the major 7 on a minor chord. Now, there are a ton of different ways that you can use this. In those two examples, you heard me use it at first in kind of a bebop scale idea. And then secondly, you heard me play it in kind of an enclosure idea. In both those places, it happens really as a passing tone, but you could totally also lean right into that major 7 and really lean into the dissonance to create some tension and then release. Finding ways to include some major 7s in your lines is really going to make you sound much more convincing on this type of tune. It's really something that I think separates a earlier on improviser to somebody sounding like they're becoming a little more advanced, a little more skilled by controlling those dissonances and then eventually resolving. We all like that as a listener, whether we know it or not. So let's just check out a little example of me really trying to get some of these major 7s in there. I'm going to, play quite a few of them in this example just to prove the point. You have to use them with discretion so it's not too much. All right, there you have it. 4 steps to helping you sound better on the tune So What, and any tune that is like this, whether it's So What, Little Sunflower, Cantaloupe Island, any tune that has long chunks of the same chord. You need to have some strategies together in order to help you navigate the changes, yes, but build melodies within the changes so your solos feel like they have direction and aren't just kind of a ramble of you playing endless eighth note lines that don't have any clear punctuation, articulation, or anything like that. All right, see you in the woodshed.